Assalamu alaikum. Today's topic is DHCP server. We will see how to configure a DHCP server in Packet Tracer. DHCP is used for dynamic IP configuration. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Control Protocol. So we will see in a network how do we configure a DHCP server and how the terminal devices access the DHCP server for dynamic allocation of IP addresses. So we will first start with a simple network with one router and two subnets. Then we will configure that network, and then we will see how the terminal devices, how PC are having the IP addresses from your DHCP server. Then we will modify the network. We will make it a little complex. We will add more router and more subnets, and we will see that the same one server would be enough for the DHCP or dynamic allocation of IP addresses to all that network. So let's just start. Okay, we will start with one router and two subnets. So we will create two subnets. And per subnet I will add two terminal devices. So I will connect those devices with the switch, and I will add a DHCP server. You can add DHCP server to either network you want. So I'm connecting the DHCP server here, and I will connect it to the switch. Okay. I will make the port labels visible. Okay, now this is the network 192.168.10.0. this is the network address, and this is 192.168.20.0. the basic configuration is the same that we have discussed and have done in previous labs, so I'm not gonna explain that, but of course I need to have that configuration. So I will just, the only thing that we will skip is the IP configuration of PCs, because we are configuring the DHCP server, so we are not gonna give the static IP addresses to these terminal devices. We will configure the server, and we will tell the router that the IP configuration must be done via this server, and then we will just click the DHCP and it will provide the IP addresses, subnet mask and default gateway to the terminal devices of this subnet. All right, okay, let's just start. The server must have a static IP address. Okay, so we will provide the static IP address to this server, and this IP address should belong to this network. Okay, so the IP address, the first address will be the gateway. 192.168.10.1 is the gateway, and the second IP address would be used as the IP address of this server. Now this is important because we will use this IP address because we need to tell the router that the IP configuration will be done by this IP address. So this is very important, and the server is given the static IP address. Okay, now we will configure the router. Okay, the configuration for the router, the basic configuration is the same, so I will just write the commands here. Enable config T interface. There are two interfaces, interface FA0 by 0, FA0 by 0, IP address 192.168.10.1, the gateway address of this subnet, and subnet mask 255.255.255.0. no shut exit. So on the same router, now we need to configure the second interface. Config T interface FA 1/0 IP address. Now the subnet gateway address of this subnet, that is 192.168.20.1 and subnet mask 255.255.255.0. no shut exit. Okay, now we will configure the server. In the server, we need to identify the pool. What is the pool? So the pool is, you can look at it as the subnet. See, we have two subnets here, so we need to assign the IP addresses to these two subnets, but these two IP addresses must belong to this network address. We have configured this network on this subnet, so the IP addresses assigned to this PC must belong to this network address. Similarly, on this side, the IP addresses that the DHCP server will assign to these PCs must belong to this subnet. Alright, now for these two subnets, jitne zyada as many subnets that you are creating, that many pool needed to be defined in your server. Pool means that pool of IP addresses from which your terminal devices will get the IP address. So there are two subnets, so we need to define two pools. For this pool definition, and the gateway address, IP address and range, all these things are defined here. For this, click the server and then click the services. Okay? Services may then we are configuring the DHCP server, turn it on. Now we will define the pool. The first is the name of the pool. Name of the pool could be anything. Yeah, you can write it network 1 default gateway. So first I am defining this pool. What is the network address? What is the default gateway of this address? So we will write it here, 192.168.10.1. DNS server, we are not configuring the DNS server. What is the starting IP address? You see, the 10.1 IP address has been used for the default gateway. 10.2 IP address has been used by this server. 10.2 is the static IP address of this server. So what will be the starting IP address? The starting IP address will be 10.3. Subnet mask by default, maximum number of users. Maximum number of users means how many users will be in this subnet. You can write any number here. Let's suppose I'm writing 20. All right, TFS, and then you will click add, and that pool has been added. Now we will create another pool for this subnet. It is network 2. Its gateway address is 20. DNS server 192.168.20. Now what is the starting IP address here? You see, 20.1 is used as the default gateway. 20.2 is available. In this case, 20.2 was the static IP address of the server. We have not configured any server here. The same server will be used here. So the 10.2 is available. So the starting IP address for this subnet will be 10.2. The default gateway, maximum number of users could be any. You will add this subnet as well. Okay? So one is the 10.1 and 10.2. So the server is on. The pool has been added. Now we see if your PC can get the configuration. We will click on the PC and IP configuration, and then you have to click on DHCP and wait. See, it is requesting the IP address. You see, the starting IP address was 10.3 and it has been configured and it has been assigned by the server. All right, now we will go to the next PC. Desktop IP configuration, instead of static I will see 10.4, it is assigned. Now we need to check here. This is the garbage value. Why? You see, for this network, this server belongs to the same subnet. So they are, when it broadcasts to this site, it is sent to everyone and the server is providing the service. On this side, we need to tell the router when it receives a request for a DHCP, a dynamic allocation of IP address, where to forward it. Alright, so for that we need to tell the router where to forward the request for DHCP. So we will go to this router and then config T, interface FA 1/0. The command that is used, it is called the IP helper address. IP helper address. Now IP helper address में we need to specify the static IP address of this server. ठीक है? We need to tell the router that request from this side for the allocation, dynamic allocation of IP address should be forwarded to this specific IP address, IP helper address. So what was the IP address of this server? 192.168.10.2 and then subnet mask 255.255.255.0. Okay, only IP helper address. Okay, so IP helper address has been added. exit. Now we see if that this side of subnet, this subnet can get the IP address. You see, now it is getting the IP address from server. Okay, DHCP request successful. Now you can add as many terminal devices to any side of the subnet and it will get the configuration by DHCP. You do not need to add the IP address. You do not need to configure the static IP address for each device. You just click the DHCP and it will get the IP address configuration from your server. Just wait for it to turn green. See, 10.5. So this is the simplest network and this is the configuration of server DHCP server. Okay, this was the simplest configuration. Now I will add another router here and I will configure a subnet on this side of the router and this subnet will also get the configuration from this server. So I will connect it through the serial port, serial 2x0, and I will add a subnet here, one single subnet. Then I will add the terminal devices, 2 devices here. Okay, since we are configuring the DHCP server, so we do not need to give the static IP addresses here. We need to configure the routers. So we will start from this router. Now we need to configure the serial port SC2x0. Okay, config T interface SC2x0 IP address. Let's just say I am using 10.0.0.0 network here. So the IP address of this site will be 10.0.0.1 and this side would be 10.0.0.2. okay, so go back here, IP address 10.0.0.1 and 255.0.0.0. so this is class A IP address, so subnet mask is 255.0.0. 255.0.0.0. sorry, this is the IP address. So we also since there is a clock, we need to give the clock rate as well, 64,000. no shut exit. The state is still down because we need to configure the other side of the interface as well. Now go to this side. Now CLI mode, enable config T interface SC2 by 0, SC2 by 0, IP address 10.0.0.2, 255.0.0.0, no shut, the change state to up and it's also green, exit, exit. Okay, we have added the new subnet. Let's say this subnet is 192.168.30.0. now let's just configure it first. Router, we will configure this interface first. Interface FA 0 by 0, IP address 192.168.30.1, the default gateway, and 255.255.255.0 subnet mask, no shut, exit, sorry, exit, exit, and the IP helper address. IP helper address के लिए what do we do? Router config T, config T interface FA 0 by 0, this interface IP helper address. Now this will also get the IP configuration from your DHCP server. So static IP address of DHCP server 192.168.10.2, exit, exit. Now for this subnet we need to define the pool here, so we will add another pool, server pool network 3, network 3 का default gateway क्या है? 192.168.30.0, sorry 30.1. DNS server नहीं चाहिए. Starting IP address should be 30.2. Number of users could be, let's just 10. Third network 30.2. Okay, let's just add it. So another subnet has been added. Now, is it the complete configuration? We have configured the router, we have configured the server. The server knows that there is a third pool that starts with 30.0, so there it has to assign the IP address, and the router knows that the request messages for DHCP server should be forwarded to this port. But still there is something remaining. If you remember, when in this network there are two routers and each router doesn't know about the existence of all the subnets in the network. So if you remember, we have done the routing here. So in this scenario, when there are multiple routers and each router, say I just show you, show IP route. The router knows only directly connected networks. It knows 10 network and 20 networks, so it doesn't know the 30th one, the third subnet. Similarly, this doesn't know show IP route. This knows only 30 network, doesn't know about the existence of 20 and 30. So we need to do the routing here. So routing could be static or it could be dynamic. We have done both. In this scenario, I will use the dynamic IP dynamic routing. Okay. So for dynamic routing, we will config T and router RIP RIP stands for Routing Information Protocol, and we will add the networks here. For dynamic routing, at each router we add the network that are directly connected to the router. So for this router there are three networks that are directly connected: 10.0, 20.0 and 10.0.0.0. So we will add these three networks here. Network 10.0.0.0, network 192.168.10.0 and 20.0. Exit. Also on this side we will add the directly connected networks to this router. Config D router RIP network. How many networks are directly connected? This one and this one. 10.0.0.0 network 192.168.30.0. Exit. Now the configuration is complete. Now let's just see if the router RIP has shared the information, and now the router has the complete information of all the networks. Show IP route. You see the network 30 is known here, you see, and R stands for RIP. Now the configuration is complete. Now this PC should get the IP address. Static DHCP, see, 30.2 and 30.2. That's all. That's all for DHCP configuration. So your configuration, the router configuration, the PC configuration, and the RIP has also been revised in this video. Thank you so much.